Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. It's going to be the first in a new series, and we're going to be focusing on a limited palette portrait painting in oils. So it's kind of a mixture of a few things we've done before. We have our quick sketching in oils, kind of a quick portrait sketch set of 3 lessons where we were working alla prima, which meant that everything was painted all at once, which is really good if you need to get a sketch down quickly. If you're working from a life drawing class or something, life painting class, something like that. This is a little bit of a step up from that, so we're using a limited palette rather than a full palette. That means we're only using a few different pigments to keep things simple. It's a good way to learn. But we're going to be working in layers, which is different from the alla prima portrait. So the alla prima portrait, everything was done from a blank canvas to a finish, all in one sitting. This time we're going to be doing multiple stages that you allow the painting to dry between different stages. So about 2 to 3 days probably between each stage. The later, kind of the mid stages, you might leave it to dry a bit longer depending on how much white paint you use, what the mixtures of your paint are. We'll be talking a little bit about drying times as we work. This lesson is just going to be looking at sketching in the underdrawing, initially in charcoal. And subsequently we're going to paint all the shadows in with a mixture of a kind of muddy brown. I've got the materials required and the accompanying PDF, so if you're subscribed to OCAD you've got it on the course page, or you can have a look on the blog, the Art Coursework blog. As always, I recommend you subscribe to the YouTube channel, just so you get updates whenever these videos come out, and you can kind of keep up to date with the work. And if you want, sign up to the OCAD course as well, and then you'll be able to get feedback from me and the other teachers on your work. So I'll quickly go through the materials, but as I say, you can also find this list with the accompanying document. So we need, for this stage, we're going to use a small canvas or panel prepared with a kind of mid-grey brown value. This was a mixture of ivory black, titanium white and burnt umber. Ended up a little bit more on the cool grey side, but that's fine. We're basically we want to tone the canvas so that we're not working on a bright white, because it makes it difficult to make judgments about our values if we're doing that. This will probably, it'll just make the whole painting kind of lean a bit more towards the kind of cool side, whereas if it was a very warm brown, it would go more brown. Today we're going to be using a piece of charcoal or a charcoal pencil for the first part of the underdrawing. Charcoal works well because as you paint over it, it just gets mixed in as the pigment kind of gets mixed in with your paint. So it doesn't really ever show up, it just kind of disappears. It does muddy your paint a little bit, but the first layers of shadows as you paint will tend to be a muddy colour anyway. For the general materials for this whole series of lessons, I've got 2 to 3 flat brushes between 1/4 and 1 inch wide, and 2 small pointed brushes. But for today we're just going to be using just one of the smaller kind of pointed brushes. When we work over the charcoal drawing in paint, we're going to be using this, and then we might switch to a bigger, flatter brush just to fill in the shadows near the end. Our limited palette is based on a palette which is made famous by an artist called Underdraw, so it's sometimes referred to as the Zorn palette if you search it online. I'm going to put a little bit of a note about this, or a link at least to another page explaining the history of the Zorn palette. But it's quite a famous portrait painting palette because the range that you can possibly get from it is quite broad, despite only having 4 pigments in total. So we're going to be using titanium white as our white, cadmium red, which is a bright red, yellow ochre, which is a kind of dull yellow, or kind of a mid-chromey yellow, and ivory black, which is our dark grey, but also our blue. So ivory black, when you mix it with white, goes quite blue. So typically that would give you enough coolness to get any kind of blues in the painting, with the exception possibly of your sitter was wearing very brightly coloured clothes that have very local colours, or if they've got very bright blue or green eyes or something like that. But you can tone things down, and the way that you work with a limited palette is you kind of contextualize everything so that if you want, say, the forehead to look like a kind of bright golden colour, you make everything around it look kind of grey grey brown, and it'll stand out. It's all relative. So if I was to put yellow ochre on this grey panel, it would look quite high chroma, quite a bright yellow. If this panel was painted with a really high chroma like cadmium yellow, and I put yellow ochre, it would look dull and brown. Everything's relative when you're painting. Values and colours are relative. So we're going to be constructing our painting in a way that makes the most of this limited palette. The great thing about learning with a limited palette is you don't have to try to remember lots of complicated colour mixtures. A lot of people, when they first start painting, they buy 12, 15 paints and they put them all out on their palette, and they're mixing all of them, and they end up with 8 or 9 different pigments mixed together to make some great colour, which works really well in their painting, but they'll never remember how to mix that colour again. So they'll mix it loads of different ways each time. It takes time, it makes things messier, you use more paint than you need to, it's more expensive than it needs to be. This palette, the only expensive paint is cadmium, the others are all just earth paints. Well, yellow ochre is an earth paint, and ivory black and titanium white I think are chemically processed these days, but they're all cheap anyway. Even if you, what I recommend is buying a limited palette of high quality paint rather than lots of cheap paint. I would always recommend that to students. So yeah, those are the paints we're going to be using. Today we're just going to be using a muddy mixture of them, but in later lessons we'll see how versatile the palette can become. You're going to need a palette to mix your paints on. So we've got a very loaded, messy palette here. You need an easel for your canvas, some thinner, so I've got a little jar here just with some mineral spirits. Odorless mineral spirits I always recommend, just because it's less toxic than typical mineral spirits and certainly less toxic than gum turpentine. In subsequent lessons you'll be using linseed oil mixed with the mineral spirits to progressively make your medium more oily, and I recommend having a painting rag or some kitchen paper towel for wiping back and cleaning if necessary. So I'm just going to be working from a photo reference, but if you guys can work from life, that's ideal. Obviously it's often a bit tricky for people, so either use a you can use a reference of yourself or someone you know if you want to paint a portrait as a present, which is always nice. Or just look for a reference that you like from a photo online and work from that. We're going to begin just sketching the main shapes. Very similar process to when we did figure drawing, when we did the alla prima portrait. We're just going to be sketching in the main shapes, the main proportions, this time in charcoal, and then quite quickly we're going to swap to paint and then fill that in. So I always begin my, well, pretty much any painting just with big general proportions. So I'm going to think about how big is the head going to be, where is it going to be in the canvas. So I've got a male figure who's wearing a kind of jumper. I don't see, in the reference I don't see that much of the lower part of the jumper. So I'm going to fit, as a general rule, if you put the head low down in the painting, it feels like there's weight above it kind of pressing it down, which can be a bit oppressive. If you put it very high up, it'll feel like it's floating high up in the painting. Usually you want it somewhere kind of in the middle, and my figure's looking to the left, and usually you will put more space where they're looking than behind their head. So if they're straight on, typically you'd put them in the middle, but as they start to look in a particular direction, you start to shift them to the right. So he's looking this way, so I'm going to put him more on this side. If he was sitting on that side and looking this way, he'd be staring at the corner of the painting, which you sometimes see it used as a compositional element, but it's quite unusual. It feels slightly unnerving, so you can use it to effect if you like, but if you're just going for a standard portrait, I wouldn't recommend it. So I'm just going to sketch in what I'm going to use as the back of his head, and then try to determine how wide I want his head to be overall. Maybe something like that. Then put a mark in for the top of his head. Let's have a look at I'm starting with big general shapes, as you can see. I've just roughly got blocked in something that approximates this guy's head. And I'm thinking about, do I like how big it is in the canvas? Is it a sort of size I want to paint? Do I want it to be bigger? I think I'll probably stick with it roughly at this size. He's got this kind of, trying to have a look at the width. So I'm measuring the width, how wide his head is relative to the bottom of his beard. It's kind of, the overall width of it fits 1 and then 2/3. So about down to here his beard is. So it's longer than typically his head would be, but that's just because the beard's extending it down, so it feels slightly long as it is. Yeah, I'm reasonably happy with that as a size of head, I think. So it angles back in there. Then shoulder drops down. It's got a sort of open jumper top. There's some kind of background elements around him. So we're going to make him about this size in the image. So let's have a look how high up his brow is. 1, 2, about 2.5. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So his brow's approximately there. Let's see where the nose is. There. And then his mouth's about here. So we're just slowly blocking these features in. These are just kind of landmarks almost. So just took a measurement and the hairline is just a touch shorter than the distance from the brow. The distance from the brow to the hairline is a touch shorter than the distance from the brow to the nose. Just wanted to widen that a bit, so I just brushed it back. I'm starting to block in shape of the eyes. It's in quite bright sunlight, this portrait, so there's not loads of heavy shadows to block in. Some shadows just underneath the eyebrows. And I would treat the bottom of the nose as a shadow just to give some more form to the face. So you can see I'm working with very linear strokes, thinking a lot about the structure of the head as I work with it. Starting to block in the shape of his moustache, dropping down to the beard. Now looking at the shape of the ear, kind of juts out here. So I've approximately got his face blocked in. It's on a little bit of an angle, the camera, so I might just, well, I might lift it off and show you guys what it looks like. So it's about that stage I'd stop working on the charcoal. So I've got it roughly blocked in. We thought a bit about the structure. We've got some guides for, as I start to paint, what I'm going to do. Drop my camera back in. So the next step, if you've got a lot of shadows, you can just quickly make a note. You can, if you like, actually one thing I will do is just make a note for those lips, which kind of merge with the shape of the beard. But then underneath, there's a little bit of a note of a shadow before. So you could, if you like, if you've got any kind of shadow shapes, that's what we're looking for. You can you could shade them in with charcoal. Anything you shade in will mix a bit with the charcoal, so don't overdo it. But something at that point you could pretty much stop. So look a bit. I'm just going to vignette this so the painting's going to just kind of trail off down there. I'm not sure what I'll do with the background at this stage, but I'm just going to block in the shadows for the figure. Next week we'll be looking at how to paint in the background. So you kind of saw how I was working. I was mostly just using I did take a few measurements, kind of comparing widths to heights and looking how many noses fit into the overall height of the head once I was happy with that. For the most part, work by eye. You can erase by smudging. You can also wet the charcoal and it sometimes wipes off, or you can use an eraser and it'll wipe off as well. Any of those things works fine. You don't have to be too neat at this stage. It's just you're trying to roughly block things in so you're happy with them. We're not adding loads of detail. That's going to be the next step where we work in adding detail to the shadow shapes. We're just approximately blocking things in to kind of have somewhere to start, because this is usually the most difficult part for any student, is kind of getting started. So now that I'm happy with the charcoal, the first thing I'm going to do is mix a kind of muddy mid-dark value, kind of a neutral colour, using my titanium white, CAD red, yellow ochre and ivory black. I'm using all of them because that'll make a brown. If I don't use all of them, if I just use titanium white and black, it'll look grey. If I just used red, it would kind of go purplish. If I just use yellow, it would go greenish. But if I use a mixture of all four, it'll make a neutral kind of brown-grey colour. The titanium white and ivory black dry quite slowly, but cadmium red dries quickly. Yellow ochre's kind of in the middle. So you could, at this stage, you could use something like raw umber, which is a fast dryer if you wanted to work within a day or two. But for the sake of just limiting myself exclusively to this palette, I'm going to use a mixture of these four. And then I'm going to dilute it with mineral spirits and start working over the top with my brush. And we'll see how we go. If I want to make any corrections, I can get a clean brush, dip that in mineral spirits, and wipe back either with the brush or I can get some kitchen towel. So just going to get a little bit of mineral spirits and make a little pile. So you'll find there's different tinting strengths for each pigment. So the cadmium red has quite a high tinting strength, so does the titanium white. It's probably a little bit too light, that value. So I want something that goes kind of to sort of a value 7 or 8 on the value scale. Something like that's not too bad. I could even go a little bit darker than that, adding a little bit of black to that mixture. Yeah, it's not too bad, so I'll stick with that. So I just tested out a little patch there on the hair. Just because I don't have to be so careful with the hair. So by eye, I'm just going to start mapping out the individual locks of the hair a little bit, not loads. This side I'll probably just make an even value. There's a little note of a shadow there, a few other little bits that kind of run through. There's a little shadow on the forehead cast by the hair. otherwise I'm just going to outline the hair. Keep my paint pretty thin. Going to run down this front edge of the face. Just tracing over what I have already done. It's a good idea usually to work kind of, if you imagine your hand is going to smudge things that are wet. If I was to paint all this down here and then jump up there, when I rest my hand it's going to smudge. You can use what's called a mull stick, which keeps your hand off the canvas, but the other thing you can do is just try to work kind of from the top down, rather than sort of working from the bottom up, because then you'll tend to start to smudge, which we don't want to do. Which means I'm going to now just really loosely block in a suggestion of the eye. Shadow shape of the eye sort of roughly runs into the eyebrow. Then we've got a little bit of the top of the eyeball showing. Everything else is probably a halftone, so I'm not going to overdo these eyes. Just do what seems necessary. There's a little shadow in here, because the light source is coming a little bit more from the left than the right. Again, don't want to overdo the eyes. Something like that's not too bad. Might join about there, and a little suggestion for where those eyes are going to start. So as I said, there's not loads of shadows underneath the nose, but we are going to kind of make a note of the shape of it, as it'll help us as we paint subsequently. So I can pretty much leave that part of the face now. Maybe just angle that in a tiny bit more. Then can start outlining this side of the beard. Got a little bit of a suggestion for the shadow shapes inside the ear, and then quickly working the outside of that ear, carrying on down. We've got two corners of the mouth are very dark. Then shape of that top lip, which kind of actually merges with that beard. So keep that quite soft, that edge. A lot of the beard's probably actually lighter than a shadow, but it's sort of borderline, so little bits of it I'm going to patch in. You can be a bit looser with something like a beard than when you're being specific with shadow shapes in eyes or around the mouth. It's a tiny little shadow shape underneath that bottom lip. And do a suggestion of where that beard's kind of cropping up, and the bottom of it is darker. There's a lot of ambient light in this reference that I'm working from, so it's not got overly heavy shadow shapes, which makes it a little bit more tricky, but also makes for a nicer, can make for a nicer painting ultimately, because it's feels a bit more like daylight, this reference that I'm working from, which is nice. So there's a little bit of a shadow down here on the neck. Then we've got shape of that jumper. Can put a little note, shadow underneath the ear, down onto this neck. And then use the last bit of my paint just to sketch in this kind of jumper jersey thing that he's wearing. It's all quite a dark colour actually. You'll probably end up a kind of bluish grey, but for the time being I'm just gonna shade in those parts of the jumper that feel particularly dark. And I can pretty much leave it at that. So if I wanted to, I could go back and adjust shapes as you work if anything's wrong. I'll just quickly show you how to wipe back. Another brush. So we've got quite a soft brush here, which if I dip in my mineral spirits, try and just get mineral spirits. If I rub that over the surface of the painting and wipe it back, you'll see it starts to smudge. I've run out of kitchen towel in my rag. So I've used the corner of this rag, and that section that I added a lot of mineral spirits to, you see it pretty much just wipes completely back clean. So you can do that wherever necessary. Work back over it again. It tends to evaporate quite quickly, so if you kind of make a correction, leave it for a bit, you can work over the top. But you do that with any kind of line, so you could wet a line, shift it down, shift it up, that sort of thing. So say I wanted to shift this shoulder in, I've got a line there. Get a little bit of mineral spirits and kind of smudge it. You can see I can just start to work it in a bit. We'll get rid of it entirely, then wipe it off, and redraw the line however I want it to be. So that's how you can make corrections. So you want to get to this stage with your piece before we start working in the variations in the shadows, which will be next week. But yeah, something like this, so you've got your shadows blocked in. It gives you a good suggestion of what the face looks like. We're not going for lots of detail, we're not going for lots of structure. Once the paint's dried, you can smudge off the remaining charcoal, which I'll probably do before I carry on working. But yeah, this is all you're doing when you're looking for your initial measurements and kind of blocking in, sketching in the overall shape of the face. So yeah, we'll leave it there for today. Please sign up to, or start following us on YouTube. Getting lots of new videos all the time, so it should be interesting for you. But yeah, that's it for today. We'll leave that to dry for 2 or 3 days and get back to work on it soon. And we'll be working in the variations in the shadows, not working in the lights yet, and still using that same limited palette. So that's it. If you've got any questions, feel free to get in touch, particularly if you're an OCAD member. And good luck with your work. Look forward to seeing it.